Hello and welcome to Myths, Mysteries, and More. This is going to be a podcast about mythology, fairy tales, and all the stuff behind them. So, this is the first episode, the pilot episode, where we're going to be talking about Hesiod, specifically his Theogony, because we're not going through all of his stories about farming. As interesting as that would be, and it would not be very interesting at all, I'm more focused on his Greek mythology stories, because they're very important. So, as the pilot, we're going to set out the structure for what I hope will be the future. We're going to go into Hesiod, what he's about, and his deal, and then we're going to go through his Theogony, and talk about the various important bits and what they mean. So with that out of the way, who is Hesiod, other than the guy you're looking at right now? Hesiod is perhaps one of the quintessential individuals that we have still when talking about mythology and ancient Greek customs and way of living. Hesiod wrote a lot. He wrote a lot about a lot of different things, specifically religion, along with farming. He wrote a lot about philosophy, because if you're ancient Greek and you're a writer, then you're probably writing about philosophy in some way, even if it's really boring philosophy. Now, a lot of people mainly think of Hesiod for his Theogony, which we're going to talk about today. But he spent a lot of time writing about farming, because he was a farmer before he became a writer. He also traveled a lot, and I don't know this for sure, but it certainly seems like his travels inspired him to write his Theogony. Because the Theogony itself is a compilation of mythologies. It is what happens when you try to take oral religion, basically, oral stories, and write them all down. Because Greek mythology was oral, and it changed from place to place. If you went to Athens, you would get one kind of, one set of stories, and if you went to, Sparta, you would get a completely different set of stories about all the same characters. So, the Theogony is an attempt to codify, I guess you could say, the mythologies and the various stories that were being told about the Greeks and the Greek gods. Now, he's not the first one to do this. You may have heard of a guy named Homer, who wrote perhaps the greatest example of an epic poem ever written in the Iliad, and then he wrote the Odyssey. But the Iliad and the Odyssey are different than the Theogony. So, the Iliad and the Odyssey, besides being epics, are mythology themselves. They are a story that is being told not from the perspective of someone outside of them and saying, oh, this is how everything works, this is where everything came from, this is where these figures come from and how they interact. It is a story being told as though everything is set in the world. So I'm not sure if that makes a whole lot of sense, so let me back up and explain it a little bit. So let me use a modern example. Pirates of the Caribbean is a very epic story, but we as the audience are hearing this story and being told this story from very personal perspectives. We are learning about the emotions and the interactions and the backstories and the motivations of the various characters, but what we're not doing is looking at the entire world in an almost scientific, dispassionate way. So, essentially, what Hesiod's Theogony is attempting to do is write the story of the universe and all of the mythologies without telling a story. So, essentially, it would be kind of like if you took Pirates of the Caribbean, and rather than talking about how, oh, this is a character and they're doing this because of this, and talking about it as it happens, it would be like if you wrote down the year-by-year explanations for things, or if you talked about like why the world is the way it is and the forces that are existing in the world and what they mean. And basically, Hesiod takes the perspective that he takes in his writing about farming and applies that to Greek mythology. Now, there are some obvious weaknesses with this. There are some obvious strengths, and we're going to get into that. But before we do that, we need to talk a little bit more about Hesiod himself. Now, the slide that you're looking at right now is a picture of Hesiod being depicted essentially as Apollo, because he has the lyre and the muse is there inspiring him to create. Now, this was a painting that was made in 1891, but it is perhaps accurately depicting the myths and legends surrounding Hesiod himself. Because when you codify all of Greek religion for people in the future for thousands of years, over time people start writing lots and lots of mythology about you as a person. So, note the fact that Hesiod himself cites inspiration from the Muses in his Theogony, which is fine. But it's a little bit different when people start depicting you as a semi-divine figure, or at least inspired by divine figures, in the same way as, like, Homer, because Homer didn't exist. Homer was not a real person. Homer is ostensibly the author, the name that we give the author, because it's a lot easier than saying, like, a bunch of different people over centuries of time who create a semi-coherent story. Like, that doesn't really fit well on a book cover, so we just say Homer. You're Homer, and that's your name. That's the guy we give it. But Hesiod is a real person. We have evidence that he was alive, that he was an actual dude who walked around on the earth. Like, we have evidence of this. Supposedly, we also know where he was buried, or at least people talk about in other writings where he was buried, that we use for history. So, who knows? In terms of trying to determine when he was writing, we ostensibly can date him to the 5th or 4th centuries BCE, which supposedly would make him pre-Homer, supposedly, depending on how you're dating things. He is not the oldest poet that we know of, but he's one of them. He's also one of the poets that we have in near completion, I want to say, because a lot of works by various old authors have been lost over time because they weren't really designed to survive, and that doesn't even count the ones that were intentionally destroyed. We really only have 3 of them that are mostly complete. The first being the one on farming, which is called Works and Days. I know, really riveting. We have his Theogony, obviously, and there's one called the Shield of Heracles. We have a lot of other fragments that are claimed to be his, but who knows. Now, it's worth noting that he writes in epic, like he writes in the same epic tone as Homer does, but he doesn't write in the same style, which makes it kind of unique, I guess you could say. Because Homer, as I said, is writing a very he's writing a traditional epic. Like, you think of the epic story of individual characters and us getting all the emotions, whereas he's writing in the epic style and writing as though he's writing a book report. And it's very different. Let's just be real. It's just very different. So the last thing we need to talk about before we move on to the Theogony itself is, what is Hesiod trying to accomplish? Now, we already said that he is trying to codify the Greek myths, but he's trying to do more than that. As you probably got a sense of when I talked about the fact that he wrote a lot about farming, Hesiod is very concerned with how things work. He is a philosopher at heart. He is concerned about the actual structures of the universe. He's not so interested in the way that the Iliad and the Odyssey are about talking about a story. He wants to talk about why things are the way that they are. So, why is the world the way it is? Why are the gods the way they are? Where did they come from? What do they do? You know, all of these things. These are questions that Hesiod is extremely interested in. But more than that, Hesiod wants to establish some kind of structure for the rest of the world and society. He is trying to understand the concepts of things like rulers and kings and citizenship. He's trying to understand culture of the Greeks and others. He's trying to understand the nature of war. He is essentially trying to attach understanding of the cosmos to everyday life. Hesiod is essentially your first kind of figure who is like drawing lines between the gods and individuals, between the gods and society. He is, through his codex, essentially saying this is why things are the way they are. He is not a scientist, but these are the same kind of principles that lead scientists forward. These are the same kinds of questions that, these are the same kinds of questions that individual scientists will ask when they try to understand the nature of the universe. So, it's important to understand all of this because when we get into the Theogony as a story, you are going to see a lot of this. And we're going to get into things like how he tells multiple versions of the same story, how there are contradictions that seemingly don't make sense that he kind of explains away, things like that. Because Hesiod was wise and smart enough to realize that he didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't arrogant enough to claim that he did. So rather than claim that this is the way it is, he simply wrote all of the stories that he had, and basically leaves it up to the reader to decide which of them is true, or maybe all of them are true, or maybe none of them are true. But that's Hesiod, and that's why we need to talk about him first before we get into it, because otherwise what I'm going to be saying later is not going to make a whole lot of sense. So just understand that Hesiod himself imparts a lot of his personal ways of viewing the world onto the Theogony. Okay, so we've talked about Hesiod himself. We've talked about why he is what he is. We've talked about what he's trying to accomplish. Now let's talk about the Theogony itself. So what we need to talk about first and foremost are the themes that are through the entire Theogony beyond creation. As a kind of explanation for why things are the way they are, particularly in society, one of the things that Hesiod spends an inordinate amount of time on is trying to explain the progression of life and the progression of the cosmos. So after the creation, he spends a lot of time delving into the patterns that dictate reality. So primarily you have the creation of the cosmos, which is then given over to the first kind of titans, which are then overthrown by the titans that we normally associate with being titans, who are then in turn overthrown by the gods. This is a very easy and straightforward way of explaining how the son will always overtake the father. Sometimes literally, sometimes naturally, but the point is that if the father attempts to constantly hold on to power, he will eventually be overthrown by those who come after him. So the slide you're currently looking at now is a depiction of the mutilation of Uranus by Cronus. So it's a depiction of a son overthrowing his father and all of the others looking on as he does this. Again, a lot of things are very literal with Hesiod, and they're meant to be. Now, having said this, let's actually get into the story and the way it's being told and what's going on. So, in the beginning, there is chaos. Chaos is a non-sexual deity. He is unisex, essentially. He is not really man or woman. He is everything and self-created. Essentially, he is just something that exists. It's unclear where he comes from. He just kind of is. He's referred to as a he, mostly, but he's not a he. I don't know this for certain, but I'm wondering if the chaos part of this myth is taken from the Egyptians, who also established that the first things to exist were the rivers of chaos, the waters of Duat. I wonder if that influenced this. I don't know that for sure, but in any case, Hesiod says that the first thing that exists is chaos, and from chaos all things spring. And so chaos immediately creates a bunch of different beings, one being the Earth, aka Gaia, who we'll get into a little bit later. He creates Tartarus, who is basically the depths of the Earth, so we have both the Earth and the underworld. He creates a being called Eros, who is desire, not to be confused with the other Eros, who is a god who is descended from others later. He creates Erebus and Nyx, who are darkness and night, which are two different things. And having done all this, chaos just disappears from the narrative forever. One thing that you get into in the early parts of the Theogony is that beings will show up and then just disappear, and you'll never hear from them again. Part of that is because, as a kind of attempt to account for literally every being in the long genealogy of Greek mythology, there are lots of figures who just aren't important. So there are hundreds and hundreds of figures who are literally there to be named and then serve no other purpose to the story. And quite unfortunately, a lot of these early gods, well, I guess not really gods, but these early, beings, which are neither Titan nor god, fit into that story. Because, Chaos shows up, creates a whole bunch of stuff, and then leaves. Tartarus shows up and then disappears when he's replaced almost immediately. Gaia shows up, and she's going to be important a little later, but aside from her story with one of her kids, she doesn't really serve much of a purpose in the story. It should be noted that this is also somewhat confusing because you have beings that are self-created or created from one being who then begin to mate and they create beings, but then those beings are either equal to them or above them in some cases. It's all very confusing when you try to put it down, but what Hesiod does is he basically just says roll with it, so we're going to. So one of the things that happens is Nyx and Erebus, who are darkness and night particularly, they mate, and from them are produced Aether and Hemera, which are brightness and the day. Do not try to understand why from darkness comes light, but essentially that's how it works in Greek mythology. Now, Gaia, having seen all this, essentially decides to self-create a bunch of beings, because she does. So she creates Uranus, she creates a being called Aurea, who is not important, you can forget about them, and Pontus, who you can also forget about because he never shows up again. Uranus, however, is the sky, or the stars and all that stuff, and he's really important. He is a major figure in this story. He is perhaps the first major figure in the story. So, you can now forget about all the figures I've just talked about, except for Uranus and Gaia, because they're the only ones that matter here. Uranus and Gaia become lovers, despite the fact that he's her son, and they start producing lots of children. These are the 12 Titans, who I will name now because, well, they're never going to come up again for the most part. They are Oceanus, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Aeptus, Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, I can't pronounce that one. Phoebe and Tethys, as well as Cronus. They are the 12 Titans. Of them, the only ones that you really need to know about are Rhea and Cronus. The rest you can basically put out of your mind. I'm just mentioning them for the sake of, totality, I guess, for completion's sake. They also produce a bunch of monsters, because this is Hesiod's way of saying that incest is bad. Despite the fact that the gods do it regularly because there's no one else for them to have sex with, Hesiod wants to try and point in why it's bad in human beings to do things like have sex with each other when you're closely related. And so they produce the 3 Cyclopses, Brontes, Steropes, and Argus, none of whom are very important except for something they're going to do later, and we'll talk about that when it comes up. They then produce the 100 Handers, which are named Codus, Briareos, and Gyges, none of whom are important, and you just need to know that they exist. So, essentially, what happens here is they produce a bunch of kids. Uranus doesn't like looking at his messed up children, so he shoves the Cyclops and the 100 Handers deep into Gaia. Not into Erebus, but just into Gaia, and it causes her lots of pain. He also spends every night going down on her. So every night when the stars come out and stuff, Uranus comes down and meets Gaia and rapes her, essentially. And as you can imagine, Gaia is none too pleased with the fact that her son is spending every night raping her against her will. So, moving on. So what comes of all this? Well, as I saw from the last slide and this one, Cronus decides to deal with it, or more accurately, Gaia decides to deal with it using her children. So Gaia looks at her kids that have not been shoved into her and goes, "Hey, your father keeps raping me and I really hate it, so I want one of you to deal with it." And she gives them a scythe and says, "Cut off his dick with this." All of the kids are terrified to do this because, well, he's the sky, and their father, and if he can impose himself upon the earth, he is obviously extremely powerful. Everyone except for Cronus. Cronus basically goes, "Yeah, okay, I'll do it." Because he realizes that if he does this, that he's going to be the new leader of everyone else. Unsurprisingly, he waits for his father to come down that night to rape his mother again, and when he does so, Cronus cuts off his dick and balls. Now, this is obviously extremely painful, and Uranus exits the story because, well, he's no longer relevant. However, it reveals that Cronus is extremely willing to take power with his own hands, and from this, he will develop many character traits as we move forward. Before we get to that point, we need to talk about the fact that a number of things occur from the blood of Uranus, because you see, he doesn't just lose his cock and balls and disappear, he bleeds profusely all over the earth. And if that's gross, it's not particularly surprising, because Hesiod loves to talk about all of the gross things that cause other things to occur. Now, from this, we get a couple things, mainly the Furies, who you might be familiar with. They're relevant in a number of different stories, but we're not really going to talk about them here, because they're not really relevant to the rest of the story. Various other things start coming into power, various nymphs, various giants, various monsters come into being because of the blood hitting the earth. One thing that also happens is the first existence of Aphrodite. Now you might be going, wait a minute, I thought Aphrodite was a goddess who was descendant of other gods, and she is, and it's the first case of this character has multiple different backstories, and they're all true at once, because Hesiod couldn't decide, or felt that he shouldn't decide which is the real one, and so instead he chooses to leave it up to you, I guess, which personally I'm thankful for, because now we get another story, one in which that could have been erased if he hadn't included it. So at this point, a lot of sex happens between all of the various beings that now make up the universe. Cronus essentially takes, like, his position as head of the table. He rules over his siblings, and everyone decides to get down to making love. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. In particular, various beings that aren't even Titans. Because you see, this is where in the Theogony, lots of various forces are created in order to explain where they came from in terms of the hierarchy of creation. Essentially, things like doom and destiny and fate and death are all born into the universe as a result of this huge amount of sex that all of the beings are happening. Things like combat and stories and war and like pain and destruction and hardship, all of these concepts are born into the universe in the forms of various gods and various beings to explain where along the line these things happened. So essentially what is going on is civilization is sprouting, and as the beings of the universe become more complex, new things are born into it. The lots and lots of sex that is happening between all of these various divinities is an explanation for how humanity became more complex. So, before the removal of Uranus's balls, the world and universe were very simple. It was very brutish. There wasn't a whole lot in it. There was just the sky and the earth, a few titans, and, day and night. And then the titans overthrow their father, who cannot fathom or consider or allow anything new to be born into it. And from that act releases a whole lot of new stuff. And that is the explanation for why things like starvation exist and why murder exists, because all of these new concepts flood into the world. It is worth noting here that Hesiod goes into great detail about every single being that comes into the universe. I don't mean that he details a lot about them character-wise. I mean that he literally lists every single, son or daughter that comes into being of, all of these unions. And there is a lot going on here. Okay, there is a lot going on here. I'll give you an example. So, after Uranus is out of the picture, Gaia doesn't stop fucking. Okay, Gaia hooks up with Pontus, the sea, and they start producing lots of new beings. Not necessarily gods, but they produce, sea nymphs and various harpies. They produce all kinds of other children who then produce things like the Gorgons. They're all having sex. And just to give you an example of how detailed this all gets, Hesiod dictates the names of all 50 sea nymphs that are produced between Oceanus and Tethys, for example. Okay? They all, there are so many different individuals who will never come up again and are mentioned in, no stories that we have that survive. But Hesiod feels the need to mention all of them. Now, you might be saying, wow, 50, that's a lot. And it's nothing compared to the various descendants of the Titans, because they start numbering in the thousands. I'm not kidding, okay? He details the 3,000 different river gods that are born of Oceanus and Tethys. 3,000 of them. There are 3,000 nymphs, okay? He dictates the various beings that come into power, like the sun from Hyperion and Theia. He depicts all of the winds that exist in the universe and all of these kinds of stars. He depicts basically everything you can imagine. Okay? Because again, this is Hesiod explaining where all of this stuff happens. And more than that, all of these things are personified in various divinities. Okay? All of the various divinities are representations of forces in the world that Hesiod is explaining. So again, going back to when I said earlier about him taking a more almost scientific view of why does this exist, this is where it comes from. This is him going, okay, why does this thing exist? Who is the being that comes into the universe, and where does it come from? Where does, I don't know, like, envy it come from? Where does that come from? Like, how do we have envy? Well, there must be a being that was born into the universe that is the embodiment of envy. And they're the reason why we can feel this. That is how Hesiod handles everything. So, let's move on now, because I feel like I've established the fact that Hesiod spends an inordinate amount of time listing literally every being that comes into existence. Now, the slide you're looking at now is a picture of Cronus eating his child. Because as you can see, having overthrown his father, Cronus descends into behaving very badly. Because you see, there's nobody around who can really stop him or make him not do terrible things, and so he kind of reverts to his base instincts. But this also is another way of Hesiod establishing the nature and progression of society. So, in another way, if you look at it, Uranus is the most simple and cruel of all of them, of all the leaders of the various divinities, because he is very basic. He exists essentially as like a force that only wishes to have sex and then leave. He is the most basic distillation of what the Greeks viewed as kind of survival. Like, what is the most basic force among living things? It is to have sex, and that's basically it. And so Cronus is a little more civilized than his father, because obviously all of these new things now exist, but Cronus is just as cruel, if not more so in many ways, because all of these things existing makes Cronus extremely paranoid. Because he understands, he has reason, he has the ability to think, he has the ability to rationalize things, and one of the things he realizes is that all of these children that are being born might pose a threat to him, particularly his own. Because now that he's the head of the table, he has something that he can lose. And he doesn't want to lose it. So what does he do? Well, he has children via Rhea, who's his sister, because again, there's nobody else to have sex with, and the gods don't particularly have the problem that humans do with inbreeding. So each time that Rhea has a child, Cronus eats the child. Now, we might be like, wow, that's cannibalism, but again, the gods are not humans. And Cronus is not actually killing them because the gods can't die. What he's doing is he's swallowing them and keeping them inside of his stomach, where they will then come of age. So they're not dead. They're just living inside of him now as, like, they're basically prisoners inside of him, so they can't cause trouble. They are essentially living the same sort of imprisonment that the Hundred Handers and the Cyclopses still are, because you see, after taking over the universe, Cronus just kind of leaves them there inside of Gaia, and he kind of goes, you know, my father had a good idea with imprisoning things that he's afraid of. So all of the various gods that are born of him, most of whom you've probably heard of because they are the Olympian gods who we will become very familiar with, are locked inside of him. They are, in the order that they were born, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and then Zeus. Now, it's worth noting that Rhea, the mother, is not particularly happy that her husband keeps eating her kids. So she keeps having them, and then immediately her husband is like, okay, time to swallow my new kids so they don't replace me. And Rhea is very unhappy about this. So Rhea goes to her mother Gaia and is like, look, I know that you love your son who castrated your husband because he was a dick, who now doesn't have a dick. But he's a terrible father, and I want to do something about it. So they hatch a plan together to hide Zeus so that he's not swallowed by Cronus. And how they do this is that they replace Zeus with a rock that's kind of Zeus-shaped. And they wrap him in a blanket so that it's just a rock in a blanket. And Cronus, being sort of simple-minded and never imagining that his wife would ever betray him in any sense of the word, swallows it and wanders off without thinking. Doesn't even bother to make sure it's him, just swallows it and walks away. Zeus then comes of age as a god living in hiding, waiting for the day when he's old enough to then fight Cronus. But he realizes, because he is smarter than his father and more sophisticated than his father, realizes that he can't do it on his own. He's going to need his siblings. So in order to do this, he goes to his mother and says, "Look, I understand that you love your husband, but he's a dick and not doing anyone any favors. I want to release the rest of my siblings, the rest of your kids. Will you help me?" And she's like, "Okay." And so what they do is they poison him. Now again, he can't die, so all this does is make him throw up all of his kids. And so all of these kids are thrown up, and so begins the war between the gods and the Titans, also known as the Titanomachy, which is basically just war between the gods and the Titans. Now, the Titanomachy has begun. You have the war of the gods and the Titans for control of the universe. One thing that's important to notice is this is another case where Hesiod is explaining the nature of loyalty and bonds and how family units work. Because Rhea, despite the fact that she has literally conspired against her husband to throw up her kids and hid one of them from him, when the war happens, she takes his side. Okay? Rhea sides with Cronus for control of the universe against her own kids. Because this is another case where the Greeks are explaining that a woman, when it comes down to it, must be loyal to her husband more than her son. There's also a bit of genealogy jealousy where you have older people being jealous of younger people, essentially, and understanding that if Zeus and his kid and his brothers and sisters and kids take over the universe, it's going to leave people like Rhea high and dry. So she sides with her husband on this, as do all of the other Titans for the most part. And the war itself is not really described in as much detail as all of the various listings of individuals that are born, which you might think is kind of odd, but remember, this is not an epic poem in the sense of, like, the Iliad. This is not a situation where Hesiod really wants to write about, like, the war. He doesn't want to write about that. He wants to write about how everything came to be, and the war is just kind of a footnote. It's just like, there was a war, and here's who won, and here's who lost, and here's how, and that's it. It's not a battle by battle depiction or anything like that. One thing that Hesiod also wants to point out, though, is that young people are not like old people and don't have the same level of bigotry or suspicions as their elders. You might go, what do I mean by this? Well, if you recall from what I said earlier, Uranus put his children who were, in his mind, malformed into Gaia. And Cronus, when he took power, wasn't interested in releasing them because he saw them as his siblings as a threat to his own rule. Zeus, however, does not view his uncles this way, or I guess in I don't know if they're granduncles or uncles, but basically doesn't view his uncles as being threats to him. And so what Zeus does is he, in order to kind of turn the war in his favor, releases the 100-handers, and he releases the Cyclops. Now, the Cyclops are particularly important, as I mentioned earlier, because they forge his lightning bolt and give him, his trademark lightning. So Zeus doesn't have his lightning on his own. Zeus is handed his lightning bolt as a weapon, as a gift by the Cyclops. They are like, here is, we together are thankful for you, our nephew, who has done us such a huge favor in letting us out. Here is this lightning bolt. Go kick your father's ass. That's what they, that's their point in this story. Zeus, unsurprisingly, armed with this weapon, defeats his father and his mother and his uncles and aunts, and he imprisons them in various places along with their various siblings and, in some cases, children. This is the point where Hesiod is trying to say that civilization is progressing again, because Zeus's reign in particularly is mostly defined by all of the things that Greek society is known for. So this is why Mount Olympus is often depicted the way we like to imagine ancient Greece looking, with the marble and the togas and, the philosophy and music and all these things that we attribute to Greek society. These are the things that Hesiod is saying occurs because Zeus overthrows his parents. Okay? And this is all very important for understanding how the universe progresses. Now, with the war over, we have to understand that Hesiod is not saying that the world is now perfect and good. Because one thing Hesiod likes to depict in his Theogony is the fact that the rule of Zeus, while good, has a lot of problems, particularly sexual ones, which again is a theme running through the Theogony of the dude at the head of the table tends to have a libido that gets him into lots of trouble. So, for example, Uranus couldn't stop raping his wife, which led her to, overthrow him. Cronus wouldn't stop eating his kids, which led to his wife, turning around and helping overthrow him. And now Zeus has a number of wives, which doesn't exactly inspire him to act well. You might think, wow, Zeus should learn from all this, but in reality, Zeus takes what is perhaps a more realistic idea and just goes, I need to come up with a new way to get around my wife killing me, essentially. Like, he takes the perspective of, my wife can't murder me if she's not around. Okay? So, for example, his first wife is Metis, and then he's like, oh wait, Metis might replace me. So in order to stop her from replacing me, I will eat her. Now you might say that's a bad thing, and it is, because he just straight up vores her, just straight up swallows her whole and makes her a part of him, just absorbs him, and from that comes Athena, who then joins the rest of the group. He then has another wife who is a Titan, which you're going to see how do I put this? Trend. He has a lot of wives who are just Titans that just exist for a bit, and then they kind of get divorced. Not really. They just disappear from the story. He doesn't really explain how or why they disappear. They just show up, and it's oh, they were married, and then don't explain how they stopped being married. Anyway, then he marries another Oceanid. He made Uranus. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but essentially they have a couple kids, and then then she disappears. He then marries Demeter, who you might be familiar with in various stories because of the whole Persephone myth. Guess what? Persephone is a child of Zeus and Demeter. They then break that off, and then he marries yet another wife. He marries the Titan that I can't pronounce the name of. That's like Mnemosyne. And from them come the 9 muses. And then that wife just kind of disappears, and he marries another Titan named Leto. From them come Apollo and Artemis, who also join the Olympians. And then he's like, well, that whole marriage is over, and now I'm going to marry Hera. And obviously from Hera comes, Ares and, Hebe and all those. What's funny is that this is where a little bit of ancient Greek sexism comes into play, because you might have noticed when I said that Zeus gives birth to Athena, because obviously Athena was inside of his first wife when she was swallowed and eaten. Hera is super pissed about this, and so she's like, I'm going to create my own kid just like you. Except her kid is Hephaestus, who you might remember is so hideous that she throws him off of Mount Olympus, and he becomes crippled for forever because of this. And that's just some ancient Greek sexism being like, well, obviously, women are incapable of creating life correctly without men, because even in ancient Greece, men had a complex about their role in producing children. Obviously, Hesiod doesn't go too much into that, but it's there, and it's pretty obvious when you think about it. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Going beyond that, though, because Hesiod is super concerned with everybody's children, and I mean everyone's children, he produces a huge genealogy of basically every god and demigod and nymph, every single person. He traces together various beings Achilles and Odysseus and Heracles and all of these various figures and where they exist in the family tree. All of these are put together essentially in the genealogy. Hesiod is super concerned with making sure this all works correctly. There are a bunch of contradictions with a lot of these in some cases, but that's not particularly interesting, and not really important. It's not nearly as important as the fact that every Greek hero that you can possibly think of is put in the family tree, as well as their children, and in some ways going up to what I can imagine is mostly the present day of when this was written. I can't tell that exactly. I don't know enough about it to tell you if this is all particularly accurate to who was alive at the time. But there's a lot of feelings like this is Hesiod's attempt to trace the various lineages of Greek city-states to various divinities. Okay? Because again, he's trying to explain why the world is the way it is. He's not interested in telling their stories, mind you, but he is interested in explaining where they came from and why they act how they act. Because everything in Hesiod is consequentialist. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but basically everything exists for a reason. Every action has a consequence. Every child then goes on to do something important, whether that be being the sun, or whether that means you founded a city-state, or whether that means you introduced something into the universe, which now everyone has to deal with. Everything has a purpose. That is Hesiod's main message in the Theogony. And that, by and large, is the Theogony. That is Hesiod's Theogony. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we end all this is, what does this mean? Okay, so we've talked about the story, we've talked about his intention. What does this mean for the wider world? What's the point? Why is it important? Okay, First things first, I mentioned earlier at the very beginning that this was Hesiod's way of explaining the universe much like a scientist might. And philosophers took note of this because they started using this as the basis for their own theories about why the universe is the way it is. So, for example, various philosophers began to ask, okay, what is the first element of the universe? What is chaos the embodiment of? Like, what is chaos? Like, obviously lots of things come from chaos, but what existed? You may apply this to the Greek ordering of the elements, the Greek 4 elements, which of them came first? For some, this was air. For some, this was water. This was a debate that was happening at the time. One thing that is super important to realize is that Hesiod's Theogony makes something possible, which is not possible in a purely oral context. Writing this all down makes it possible for philosophers and theologians to speculate about things in terms of their totality. So what I mean by that is, it is now possible for people to go, okay, the world is a greater whole, and we have a place in that whole. What is our place in it? What is the place of the gods? What is the place, what do they do? Where is their place? We can now speculate on this because there is a definitive whole that we are working with. In some ways, it is like the pre-Bible to post-Bible formulation that happened in Christian mythologies. Beforehand, you're working with a lot of different oral traditions. You come together and you formulate the New Testament, and then you now can collectively debate over the same thing. And this allows a new level of speculation and a new level of philosophy to take place, which is not possible when everybody is working with a different text. Now, it's also important to realize that this kind of new way of thinking about theology, in terms of being like, okay, this is the way everything works, allows for a very strictly Greek interpretation of the world. It allows different city-states to now start to begin to formulate the concept of being Greek. Because again, we're dealing with a time when all of these places were city-states. They did not view themselves as part of Greece. There was no concept of Greek nationalism. You are defined mostly by wherever city-state you were born in. This concept that all of Greece shares roughly the same gods and roughly the same stories permits a kind of collectivization that does not exist before this point. Much in the same way that the Iliad and the Odyssey allowed different city-states to go, our heroes were all a part of this great journey, and this creates a kind of foundational myth that exists for all of Greece. The Theogony allows for all of the Greeks who identify various gods as their own to say, okay, your gods and our gods are the same, they all come from the same place, we have something in common. And again, this lays the groundwork for a foundational myth that did not exist beforehand. Now, it is worth noting that the Theogony is not the end-all, be-all of anything, okay? Much in the same way that the Theogony took a lot of different oral histories and a lot of different traditions and shoved them all together, later writers will take this kind of foundation and build upon it. You will get a lot of playwrights who will take this kind of structure that has been given to them and begin writing and formulating stories about how various things came to be. So, for example, the Bacchae by Euripides is a good example of taking a god and saying, how did this god come to be? How did this story come to be? How do we explain this? Okay, and you do this by building on the structure that has been created by Hesiod. Hesiod provides the foundation for nearly every playwright that we still have, except for Homer, for the most part. So it's an extremely important work. Even if it's not a particularly fun thing to read, because a lot of it reads like a list, and it is one. That's basically all it really wants to be. And that's the Theogony. I hope I made this sound interesting. I hope this has been a good first episode of this new podcast I'm looking forward to making more of. Hopefully in the future, when I have more images, I can use more slides. But this has been the pilot episode of Myths, Mysteries, and More. I don't know what I'm going to do next. We'll find out. But anyway, see you all later.